a company called Pronto Forms. And I'm here really to talk about the Migrate to Flows tool, which has just been released in Salesforce. Great segue, Fred. You know, when Tamateo, hoping you're pronouncing your name right, asked about flows, I was very keen at the beginning of this presentation to say, this is not a presentation on flows because it's such a huge area. You know, it really is. You know, we've got the basic tools, workflow and process builder, of course, which we're all hopefully familiar with. Does everyone use, everyone's used automation tools, presumably of some form or another within Salesforce, have they? I know the long-time members definitely will have done, you know. So I was very keen to point out that this is not on flows, but I will touch upon some areas of flow. So hopefully you'll get something from that. I would echo everyone else's sentiments. You know, Salesforce Ben in the UK, they have some great run-throughs, you know, of the basics of flows, trailheads, of course, Apex hours as well, which I joined some time ago. But I also wanted to touch upon, you know, this user group. Being a Salesforce administrator, developer, or whatever, it can be pretty lonely, you know, if you're working in a company. And I've struggled with that over the past 3 years. And really, this user group gives you that sort of channel where you can come and admit your ignorance. You know, it's such a huge ecosystem that you cannot possibly know everything about it, you know. So that's where something like this really comes in useful. I can come here and say, I don't know how to do stuff, you know. I've got Kevin and Nash's names peppered throughout my company's org because they have worked as contractors for us in the past, you know, before my time. And that's how I got introduced to the user group. And then since then, you know, it allows me to come here to learn from everyone else what they're doing, you know, within Salesforce, the new stuff that's coming out. So really, this sort of group has just been invaluable to me over the course of my Salesforce career. And that's not been long, 3 years, you know. I have been system administrators of various other systems of the past, but only in the last 3 years have I really got into Salesforce administration. And because I have sort of business knowledge as well, you know, I've worked in sales, I've worked in finance and marketing, and I've been a trainer in my time as well. It gives me all the tools I need to carry out the processes that the business needs, you know, to convert what salespeople are saying, what they want, into, you know, actual automations within Salesforce. And it's everything. And I say to my team at the moment, never be afraid of admitting ignorance, you know, because that's the best way to learn, to say to someone, I don't know what I'm doing here, you know, to reach out to people. And I'd just like to thank Nash, Kevin, you, Fred, everyone on this call for helping me in my journey. You know, it really is invaluable. So let me just share my screen. Hopefully you'll all see my presentation. Let me do screen 2 there. There we go. So hopefully you will see the presentation. Let me know if you can see that. All good? Migrate to flows. Everyone can see that? Yeah, I'll assume you can do. That's all good. Just say I work for a company called Pronto Forms within Ottawa. You know, they're a low-code application platform, a lot like Salesforce in many ways, you know, but we concentrate on forms for field service workers and particularly on mobile phones and iPads and whatnot. But today I'm here to present to you on the Migrate to Flow tool. So we're going to cover a couple of topics, much as Fred's presentation. If you have any questions at any point, just raise your hand or speak up. I have no problem answering questions as we go along. And much as Fred's presentation demonstrated, it really progresses the conversation, you know, and I get to learn about stuff. Anyway, we're going to go through what are flows. You know, it's pretty obvious to most people, but, you know, we've got a different range of experience within the group. Why migrate? The tools that are available to you, in particular, the Migrate to Flow tool. Then we're going to talk about migration strategy, fun, and like the question I am constantly battling against, how many flows should you have? And I haven't come to a resolution on that question. Maybe people can provide their input on that particular area. But first of all, we'll go through what are flows, you know. They're the latest automation tool for Salesforce. Previous to this, we have workflows, of course, which are very straightforward. You know, if this happens, then do that. Then they moved on to Process Builder, you know, which was a sort of point and click layout where you could bring nodes in and you could put fuller automations together. It just wasn't a case of if this, do that. It was a case of if this, do that, and then do this. So that was the next generation of automation. And then just recently, well, how long have flows been around for, Nash? 3 years or so?
Well, in this design, 3 years, but they are present more than 6 years. Classic had flows too. Okay. It was just not very useful then. But they were doing some of those things, yeah.
Exactly. So they've been around for a while, but it's really only over the last couple of years that they have become useful, you know. Previously,
Andrew, can I cut in for a second?
Of course.
I used flows back around 6, 7 years ago. I remember going to a Dreamforce and talking to the product manager there, saying, "Oh, this is a great tool. Why don't you fix the user interface so that it's a lot easier to use?" And of course, at that time, the manager thought, "Oh, this is going to go away. We're going to get some other type of tool." But anyways, it was around for I would say maybe even 10 years when it first started. But you're right. Over the last 3 years is when they built a proper user interface for the tool, and they've really added to it.
Yeah. It is, yeah, certainly that's my experience. As I said, I don't have the history of how long this thing has gone back for, but certainly it's only over the last couple of years that it's become really useful. And, you know, we used to get Nash into our company to do the things that you could only do through code. You know, I don't want to go into Apex triggers and classes, you know, because I don't fully understand them, but that's the coding level within Salesforce. And up until the last couple of years, there was only things you could do through Apex coding. And now that's been brought into the point and click interface that is flows. So when I had a discussion with Nash recently, you know, he said that he very rarely uses Apex code these days because he can do all this in flows. And that is huge, you know, because it's putting the power into Salesforce administrator domain rather than just developers. So how confident are people in flows? Have they used them? Fred, obviously you've got some quite complex flows in Service Cloud, but what's the general understanding of the group? Have they all used flows? Yeah, to a certain extent. Anyway, we'll go.
Yes. I would say that it certainly, you've got some new people, so certainly the new people are still building their skills. But then you've got some very experienced people, so it's a range.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, I find them incredible. You know, I think the things you can do with them now are just absolutely amazing. You can design very, you know, complex. You can design simple flows, of course, and I've got some examples of this here. You know, this is a relatively straightforward one, just a line that's going down. It started by something very simple happening on the account, you know, and this happens to be when someone changes the ownership of an account, you know, and all we're doing there is just making sure that the contacts and various other objects which are related to the account also follow the same ownership. Or you can get into something like this, you know, and Fred provided some examples beforehand, which is very complex, you know, and you can also loop flows together. So it really has opened up a whole new world to the Salesforce administrator, being able to do very complex automations within your Salesforce org. Now, why are we talking about, where's my slideshow gone to, migrating? Well, it's basically because Salesforce have recently announced that they will be retiring the previous automation tools, workflows and process builder. So already you can no longer create new workflows. If I jump into my workflow rule screen here, oh, it is actually saying you can still create a new rule, but their timeline, which they have basically displayed, says that they will be, or should already have done, turned off the ability to create new workflow rules. And eventually they're going to turn off the ability to create new process builders as well. So really it's one of those situations where we are slightly being forced into it. You know, they have this new tool that they want everyone to adopt. So they're slowly going to be retiring the previous automation tools in workflows and process builders. So it's something we're going to have to do at some point. And as always in these cases, you know, it's better to prepare for it so that we are not caught out when they do finally retire it. Now, it might be something like Salesforce Classic, which they said they're going to retire for as long as I have been working in the ecosystem. But it will be coming. So now is the time to basically think about migrating your workflows and your process builders into Flow. And at the end of the day, it's an opportunity because Flow is a far better tool than those previous automations. So, first of all, they've provided us with a very simple way to migrate our existing workflows and process builders using the Migrate to Flow tool. Now, if I was to jump into my sandbox org here, and I'm just going to go to the process automation setting. If I just type in migrate here, then it's going to come up with this migrate to Flow option, and it'll present you with this screen. Okay, so this basically lays out all the existing workflow rules, or if I just change the sorting of it, the process builders that you can migrate across. Okay, so me and my team were very excited when this basically was released. It gave us an easy way, instead of having to go through all of our current workflows, map them out, and then transfer them into flows manually. We now had a tool that would allow us to do that. But it comes with a caveat, okay? The Migrate to Flow tool supports workflow rules that contain these items, relatively straightforward, but it doesn't support workflows that contain any of these items. Criteria with no defined workflow actions, global variable fields, fields on related records. That's quite a big one there, okay? And it goes on to say these are the other sorts of things that the Migrate to Flow tool won't support. And that was brought right home to me when we started to actually migrate some of our workflow rules. The first one we happened to choose was this opportunity, new closed were not. You know, we have this workflow rule that very simply sends out an email to all our sales team when a new opportunity is closed won. Our sales team used to be all in the office, of course. Now they're all remote. They used to have a little Budweiser light that went off whenever a new opportunity closed, because they like to celebrate new opportunities being won. So anyway, we came to this one, and we've got this Migrate to Flow button in the top right-hand corner here. And it takes you through, you know, the usual Salesforce interface. Yep, okay. Oh, typical. It's taking me back to that screen. Let me just try that again. And immediately we were presented with this error message saying we can't migrate this workflow rule to a flow. We can't migrate it because its criteria contain a cross-object reference. Because it was trying to do something across objects, you know, this would basically send out an email message. So right off the bat, we thought, well, this is rubbish. But we persevered, and the other one we tried was, this was quite a complex process builder that we have, and we'll simply highlight that. We're going to click on that process builder again, click on Migrate to Flow, and again, it thinks about it, and pretty much instantaneously, you know, actually creates the flow for you. It's taken all the nodes from the process builder, although, you know, you can get more complex. If you have a process builder with many nodes attached to it, you can choose whether to bring those across as their own individual flows or all in one flow. So pretty robust tool, but it does fall over with certain things. And there you see, it's created a flow from that process builder we had. So we have to think to ourselves, you know, what is the best way to actually do it? Given the fact that it doesn't work on all workflows, it seems to work on all process builders, it does provide an easy interface for migrating your existing automations, but there's always going to be a decision that you will have to face, okay? Now, this is where we get onto the migration strategy. We have been preparing for this for quite some time. We have quite a lot of historical workflows. We have quite a lot of historical process builders in our org at the moment. And given that not all of them are going to work using the migrate to flow tool button, we had to decide on a strategy. And the first part of any strategy like this is actually documenting exactly what we have within our current automation tools. Now, I sometimes struggle with documentation. You know, we can do some very exciting things within Salesforce. Documentation is never exciting, okay? No one likes doing it. It's always the thing that gets pushed to the very bottom of the list. I'm sure Nash would agree with me, but because of his role, he has to put documentation together for these things. It's very important, and it provides you with a basis for not only what is your current state, but also gives you that opportunity to say, okay, how can we improve things in the future, such as a situation like this, where we are being forced to move our automations from one platform or one system for another.
Okay, Andrew.
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead, Nash.
Okay, Karen. Just one point on documentation. It's when you are doing documentation, it's best practice these days to document what you have, because somebody else was building it when you weren't there probably. Or if you did it a few years ago, you forgot about everything. you need to know what it does. And when you're doing this, do acceptance criteria for new way of doing this. You have opportunity to simplify it. You have opportunity to remove it. But when you're doing this, because you need to do regression testing after you put it in place to be sure that it's still doing what business expects and that you didn't broke it, put your acceptance criteria for user acceptance testing in the same documentation, have it in one place, and run by it when you're ready to run. This will be my 2 cents on documentation.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, I have a question. We're going through this where I'm doing my current contract, and I have a developer that I've assigned that will do this process. I was wondering, in the documentation, do you have a template that you used that you think is successful, and were you putting it in what type of document were you putting with Word, Excel?
I was just about to share that in actual fact, Kevin. Okay. So that is the perfect timing for your question. It's almost like we planned it. But no, we currently use Quip within our organization. I don't know if anyone's used Quip at all. You know, it's sort of a collaboration tool, documentation. The most important thing it does is allow you to bring Salesforce records into a document, you know. When we were going through the buying process with Salesforce, you know, they actually said that they run the majority of their business from Quip these days, you know, because they find that it's sometimes difficult to get salespeople into Salesforce. You know, Fred was mentioning all our service users, you know, support, they're in Salesforce all the time. Salespeople tend to struggle with going into Salesforce and adding data. But more importantly, it was bringing together structured data that we have in Salesforce, you know, all those fields and all the good stuff we have in around accounts and contacts and opportunities and whatnot, with unstructured data, which was sort of conversations that people would have, you know. So we found it was easier for salespeople to go into a document like Quip, and then put in their notes from a particular meeting they were having with a client or whatever. But I'll just show you, if I had to type in the @ symbol there, and then choose, and you can see I've got a whole list of things we can add in here: project tracker, calendar, Kanban board, spreadsheet. But there's also this area up here where you can bring in Salesforce records as well. And if I just click on insert here, and then it allows you to search for any record that you have in Salesforce and actually bring it into this document. So you're getting that structured data into a document which is friendly to everyone. If I was just bringing this account just here, it actually brings this data in. So instead of forcing people to go into Sales Cloud or whatever, they're getting that information available to them in a more user-friendly way. But on the back of that, it's allowed us to start linking, our records in Salesforce with the documentation as well. So this particular one just here is just a document on one of our flows that we have, particularly its creation of a financial record. You don't have to worry too much, but this is the format that we have decided upon, and it's pretty straightforward. It just describes every single node in the flow. So how it started, first of all, decision element, what it does after that to get records, loop, assignment, and then the final update records elements at the end. But whilst I was doing prep for this presentation, and I think it was Salesforce Ben actually, they basically said the simplest form, because you don't want to get an overly complicated document, is simply trigger decisions and actions that are carried out. That would be the very simplest. And especially when we're talking about workflows, that tends to be the format they follow. And the same thing for Process Builder, in that each node you would just document what the trigger was that set it off, and then what action it took, and if there are any decisions in the middle. So that was the simplest, and it tends to be the one that we have adopted at Pronto Forms as well.
Can you show the one for a workflow too? Because this is for a Process Builder.
Oh, goodness me. I don't think, because I've got my team working on them at the moment. So I don't think they've gone through any of it. But yeah, it's just anything, even if it's a notepad, a document is better than no document. And when we were going through this, we found, and I have to thank, the people who came before me. So if I go into my flows just here, Kevin, I don't know if it was you, Nash, I don't know if it was you, or a previous Salesforce administrator, you can see here, we've got a naming convention that makes it very easy, because the name of the flow, or if I was to go into workflows, always starts with the object that triggers it. So if I just go into workflow rules here, you'll see, well, it's generally the case, but you can see all these ones are triggered by the case object. So if you get anything else out of this session, I would take that as the prime example. Naming conventions in Salesforce, because when it comes to an exercise like this, you can immediately see which object is triggering these automations, and it makes it so much easier, because when you are moving across to flows, you want to break it down by object, because...
Can I interrupt here?
Yeah.
One benefit of naming convention like this is when you get to the next step of DevOps, when you're moving data from sandbox to the production, it will use your API name for you to choose which element of flow you want to move. And you be careful, your label can easily be not matching your API name in the flows because of how you save on the flows. And this may cause confusion down the road, but having something like this, even if you have special column to say what object this is running on, these details are not visible in DevOps tools and other things down the road. Naming will help you to streamline that. You always can easily choose what you're looking for. Otherwise, you get somebody confused, because not same people does DevOps, and then you tell them move this flow and they cannot find this API name because in some reason it wasn't aligned and things like that, blah blah blah. But naming convention is very, very critical here. for all process, and I use the similar one on all the time in on my projects. So when I am in charge of defining those things or advise people on those.
It's huge, you know. One day I will be the first administrator at a new company and I'll be able to design all this for myself. But most of the time, you know, in your career as Salesforce administrator developer, you are going into orgs that have existed, you know, before you. And I just thank everyone who went before me in our particular org that they stuck to this naming convention, because you can say, okay, I can see all the automations which are triggered from the account object, you know. And specifically when we're talking about migrating stuff to a new tool, well, then you can say, okay, I've got all the automations that run from the account object, so we can begin to move those across and then decide if they need to be strung together into one flow or if they need to exist individually. And that's a whole other question, which I think I'll get to on my next slide. So decide upon your strategy. You know, once you've documented everything and you have a clear picture of exactly all the automations that exist in your org, then you'll be at a point to say, hey, does this even make sense to move it across? Does it need improving? And then the how. Are we going to use the migrate to flow tool, you know, which just simply brings them across? Or are we going to take the opportunity to say, okay, this is the perfect time to maybe improve some of these as well, you know, to build one big flow. And then the final point on this strategy slide, implement and test in a sandbox, you know, and that would be crucial for anything, any sort of project like this, you know. For those of you who are just starting out on your Salesforce journey, Salesforce do provide a free partial sandbox on most orgs, you know. You generally have to go up to the very higher levels to get a full sandbox, which contains all your data. But they do provide a partial sandbox, so you can at least test with a subset of your data, you know. Make sure you don't break anything. In my previous company, we had a developer who lived on the West Coast, and he had a habit of changing everything in production during his nighttime. So those of us on the East Coast would wake up and everything would be broken, you know, and then he would slowly wake up on the West Coast and we'd been screaming for 3 hours. But so test everything within a sandbox, you know, with live data. Because it's just crucial. You don't want to blow up your help desk or your support team who are handling anything that goes wrong. I'll just take a pause there, see if anyone has any questions at this point. Pretty straightforward. Okay.
Yeah,
Good.
This is not just one point that I would like to to exercise here is just don't take one-to-one migration. Tool is great to do this, but then you are losing opportunity to improve, to optimize, to do other things. You know, it's in other words, don't be lazy. Use this opportunity. Create this as project that you need to have stakeholders and user to test and everything. Don't take it light. This would be my point here. Make it as kind of any paid project, even if it's not paid, if you are doing this for yourself for a long time upfront. And
great. I have a quick question. So Andrew mentioned, you know, testing, right? Like a sandbox filled with some data in there. So if you have a developer sandbox, right? Like you don't have any data in it. Anybody has like what's the experience like you have? How do you, is there any quick way to loading some dummy data there other than use a pro sandbox or partial sandbox? You know, when you have a developer sandbox, you have like 200 megabytes, right? Like a space there. Like if you are creating manually every time you create a sandbox and every time manually creating dummy data, it takes time. Any like tricks, you know, to loading data, predefined data to there like quickly?
There is, I think
yeah,
there is a tool that I've seen in the past that allows you to create sort of a dummy data very quickly, isn't there, Nash? But
I think there is an App Exchange one, maybe even free, that is doing simple generation of some standard objects data. But in my experience, when I'm working this in my projects, I always, there is now test flow feature that you can use to set up simple tests on your flows on the object. And this is not in prime state yet to be used because it supports one object, one record, insert, create, update scenarios, but doesn't do well with cross objects on related objects to test it and things like that. But it is what is coming from Salesforce as next generation of test capability on the flows that you will be able as administrator. When you are debugging your flow, you will see button create test scenario of this debug scenario, and this will stay in your sandbox, and you can run it in every time when you open the flow, when you change something, you can run it and see did you destroy something or not. These things are coming. They're not fully ready for GA yet, but they are working on it and they are making every release list to be better. Your other options for testing flows is to using Apex test classes like you do for Apex code, and then create your scenarios, have data factory in those Apex classes that will prepare database for testing. You have records, then you save them on DML, will execute flows, and if flows fail, you will get message that didn't do well, and then this is your test too. When I'm talking about this, when you are promoting your flows from sandbox to production, it's always going to end up as inactive flow in production, unless you have test coverage for your flows that is over 75% of something, how they call it. This is because you have option in production checkbox to say, I want to deploy my active flows. What means whenever you deploy it, immediately they became active. What is right now, if you didn't go and check this checkbox, whenever you deploy flow from sandbox to production, it's going to be inactive. You will need to go open the flow and click on button to activate it if you want to use it. But in this case, you don't have to have test coverage for it and all those kinds of things. There is a lot of responsibilities with flows because now you, as administrator, you have option to destroy things, to make it worse, to break something and things like that. What was before, you were fairly safe that to say, I'm administrator, I cannot break anything, everything is controlled for me. It's not the case anymore. But to answer your questions, there is no easy ways to generate data. You can find some tools on App Exchange, but how good they are, I don't know. I never used one. I always create my own test data or data factory in code if I want to test something. But maybe somebody else knows.
I have a question. What are your best practices for testing? Do you do it in a group? Do you do it yourself, or do you pull a stakeholder outside of your team? How do you go about it?
Yeah, it's very much in a team at the moment. I'm very lucky because I was the only Salesforce administrator when I joined my company. I've mentioned Kevin and Nash were brought on as developers, to help with certain projects, but we've slowly, the business has started to recognize how important Salesforce is. Thank goodness. I think it's very silly that they don't. But, so I'm slowly building up a small team. None of them are certified as administrators. They've either come from areas of the business and have shown an aptitude towards technology, and then we've brought them into the administrator role. It's actually called business analyst, because they very much are liaising with their previous departments because they already know the business processes. So it's very much a hybrid model. If we have a technical person on the other team, then we will test with the end customer, you know, the business department. Sales, not so much, you know, they tend to be very much like, why is this system not working for me, and want to throw it out the window. In fact, I had a guy who I met recently. He's a great salesperson. He doesn't like systems. And he constantly said to me, let's burn Salesforce to the ground, at which I said, well, you know, it's not completely my system. It's just a platform, just because he found it frustrating more than anything else. But it's very definitely a hybrid model. You know, there are certain things that only we know about, you know, in particular, financial records that I mentioned just very briefly. Our finance team aren't very tech savvy, so we would tend to do the testing ourselves there. If it's a switched on business department, then we will get them involved as well. But it's very much the team, you know, this is really our first big project together, and we're coupling on a sort of making sense of the account object, you know. The org has changed over the years, you know, people have added fields willy-nilly just when they want to, you know, and now we have multiple page layouts per record type, per profile, and it doesn't make sense. So now with Lightning record pages, we're hoping to get to just one page, you know, and using visibility filters so everyone can just use one. But it's very difficult. So this is the first project we're doing together. We're just finishing off the documentation stage at the moment. Then we're going to look at the account object first of all and decide on what we're going to do with the processes and workflows that currently exist off that. And then we're going to decide whether to do it via the tool. I think we will do for certain cases, you know, but it leads us on to our next question: how many flows per object, you know? And I'm still struggling with this question. So if anyone has any advice on this, I'm happy to hear it. But yeah, we're just going through it at the moment, Francisco. So I'll probably report back to this group in a couple of months' time and let you know how it's gone. But really what it comes down to is how many flows do you want running on a particular object, you know? And I've come across so many different pieces of advice, and I think the simple answer is it depends, you know. I would love to get to a point where there is just one flow per object. But then I think to myself, well, that's going to be a very complicated flow, you know, and I have to think about the future administrators who work for my company, and I won't be here for all of my working life. I know that. So I don't want to have them. We're going to have the documentation, fine, but it's still difficult to come in and uncouple or work out exactly what a flow does. So I think to myself, oh, well, in that case, maybe we should have one flow per automation, you know. And if you get into something like this, again, Salesforce have provided, sorry, the bar from Zoom is sitting right on top of my tabs within Chrome. But if we just go to flows here, you know, they have just introduced this very useful piece of technology, which is the Flow Trigger Explorer, you know, in the top right hand. And then you can choose what object you want to look at, and it will tell you all the flows, and more importantly, the order in which they work, you know. So we're sort of getting into, okay, well, maybe we can have an individual flow for each automation we want to carry out, you know. But I think ultimately it will depend, you know. You might have seen on that previous slide the rule of three, and this is getting into the sort of developer territory. And I think this is best practice within Apex, Nash. Tell me if I'm wrong, that you have one flow per object on a before, create, or update, one flow on after, create, or update, and then one flow per object on before delete event as well, you know.
Yeah, it's
so
I can give you my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And they're always the best one, you know, on the market, but there was different confusing best practice from Salesforce on process builder when they say don't do do one process builder per object, blah, 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 what is not realistic because you want to isolate your process by function. And when you change something in this function, you want to know exactly what is outcome of it, that you can easily do testing and be sure that it's working what you expected and blah, blah, blah. But this was for a while similar approach for the flows until recent invention of this option that they coupled out your execution of the flows to be outside of the flow or before the flow is executing. What means you can define order of execution. You can now have as many flows as you like per object. And this is the best practice that they recommend now. Also, it depends, may differ to your style of thinking or coding and things like that. But give you one reason why I am thinking this is best practice. When you define these 4 business use cases, and let's see, you put them all in one flow, what you can do easy, then whoever is going to maintain this or maybe disable one function down the road because it's not needed anymore, you need to retest all 4 use cases. You need to be sure that you didn't accidentally disable something else and things like that. What is too much work if you think about this? You need to think about this too much, and whoever is going to open this flow, it's hard to read, it's not user-friendly or admin-friendly and things like that. Now, when you have this option, what's happening first? Salesforce have entrance criteria on the flow. This is your first screen when you create flow. This is what's happening before flow runs. And it works just on the object that you have access to or you're running flow for. So it means just fields of this object are part of this criteria. And if you are thinking well and you define this criteria well, your flow won't take any server resource if it doesn't meet criteria. If you create one flow for all 4 use cases, every time flow needs to run, open the process, analyze everything, put everything together and try to execute your nodes, what is unnecessary overhead on the server is slowing down your save record time and everything else. And you are building overhead for the server that is not needed. Also, you're building over-engineered use cases for testing and maintenance down the road. What means I'm suggesting to everybody, to my junior team members, to my clients, we build as many flows as we need to run on the object, and we have good entrance criteria that we know that it's running just when it's needed. We don't run it for nothing. And then we go from there. Also, I'm propagating something like subflows. If you have piece of flow that is reusable, instead of building it every time for every other object, you maybe can come up with something that is reusable, and you just can pass parameter like record ID and then execute maybe emails using the subflow and things like that. You don't build all these things in the flows every time. You can optimize flows on this way for future maintenance and things like that. But my answer for this would be go as much as you like, try to consolidate flow by business function sense, that when you test it, you know what is outcome easy, that when you open it, you can easily understand what's happening inside of it, and then have good entrance criteria that doesn't run when it's not needed to run. This would be my answer.
Superb. Thank you. And that comes back to Fred's point, you present on something and you learn for it yourself. There is no better way to learn a subject than to actually teach someone else about it. So thank you, Nash. That's given me some good guidance. We went through, and it comes back to a conversation I was having with Fred before the call. We were going to migrate our Zendesk to Service Cloud, and we went through the implementation. We went through, the consultancy with an external firm, because I don't have the resources for such a big project. And they said, whoa, someone's gone crazy with flows. And I thought, have I done something wrong? But Now I've talked to Nash, and Nash has validated. I much prefer that, because for the reasons you said, otherwise you have these flows that run every time an object a record is changed, which is not ideal. So thank you for that, Nash. That's perfect. But you will decide upon the best course of action for you. I would highlight again the two main points from the whole presentation. Document it, so that you have that baseline of this is how things were, and you can use that for improvement, and naming conventions as well, because it's going to make it so much easier. It's made it so much easier for us to see all these automations that come off the account object or the opportunity object. And when you come to a project like this, it just makes it so much easier to move things across. So that's it for me. How am I doing for time? A little bit over, but any questions at all? All good. I shall hand back to Nash, Kevin, you then in that case. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Andrew. It was great conversation. I really enjoyed it. I will stop recording.
That was great, Andrew. Thanks so much.
Pleasure.